Under the soft, dim light of a museum display case in Oxford rests a block of fired clay no larger than a shoebox. The Weld-Blundell Prism. It sits there quietly, as it has for decades, behind glass, in a room where the air barely moves and the footsteps of visitors come and go like distant weather. Most people walk past it. A few stop. Fewer still stay long enough to really look. On its four sides, ancient scribes carve the names of 8 rulers who reigned before the Great Flood, attributing to them a quiet, impossible dominance over the earth that lasted exactly 432,000 years. Not approximately, not roughly, exactly, and that number should give you pause. It did not fade or soften over time. The scribes who pressed it into the clay were not guessing. They were recording, as if they were setting down a fact as stable and unquestionable as the weight of stone. But it didn't. Tonight, we walk slowly through the broken record they left behind, tracing the faint lines of the primordial sages who taught them, and the questions that still remain in the clay. You don't need to hold on to these years, or to this day. The day has already passed. Your only job is to rest. Tonight, perhaps, you're listening, like James, in Nashville, settling in after a long day of woodcrafting, letting the steady rhythm of ancient history slow your mind. If this kind of quiet story finds something in you, go ahead and subscribe and let us know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Wherever you are, simply lie back and let go. Let us begin. There is something about clay that stays with you once you've held it, the weight of it, the slight coolness against the palm, the way it holds a print long after the hand that made it has been gone for centuries. The scribes of ancient Mesopotamia knew this. They worked with river clay dug from the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, clay that was soft enough to press a reed into and hard enough, once dried or fired, to outlast almost everything else the ancient world ever made. Paper burns, wood rots, metal corrodes, but a fired clay tablet buried in the right kind of soil can survive 4,000 years without losing a single character. That is one reason we know anything at all about the Sumerian king list. Not because someone chose to preserve it in a great archive or pass it down through careful hands, but because clay, by its nature, endures. The Weld-Blundell Prism is the most complete version of that list we have. It was purchased in 1922 by Herbert Weld-Blundell, a British collector, likely somewhere in the region of ancient Kish, a city that features prominently in the list itself, and eventually given to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, where it still rests today. It dates to somewhere around 1800 BCE, which is already old, but the stories it records are far older than that. The scribes who carved these particular characters into this particular piece of clay were themselves copying from something earlier, something they already considered the deep past. That is worth sitting with for a moment. When the scribe pressed his reed stylus into the surface of this prism, he was not recording his own era. He was looking back, far back, into a time that felt ancient even to him. The text begins simply, almost gently. According to the earliest scribes, when kingship descended from heaven, kingship was first in Eridu. That phrase, when kingship descended from heaven, has fascinated scholars and careful readers for well over a century now. The tablets record it not as poetry or metaphor, but as plain historical statement, delivered in the same dry administrative tone as a census record or a grain inventory. 5 cities, 8 kings, and a span of time so enormous it exists, outside anything the human mind can naturally hold. The numbers themselves are worth slowing down for. Alulim, the first king, is said to have reigned in Eridu for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalgar, ruled for 36,000 years. A king named Enmenluana held the throne for 43,200 years. The list continues through 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Nippur, each handing off the torch of kingship in turn, each with rulers whose reigns stretch across tens of thousands of years. The total, when you add them together, reaches exactly 432,000 years. And then the flood came, and everything changed, and kingship descended again. And the list begins again, with shorter reigns, names we can sometimes corroborate against other records, cities we can partially locate on modern maps. That transition from the impossibly vast to the merely ancient is one of the quiet puzzles at the heart of this document. Whatever the scribes intended by those enormous numbers, they clearly intended something. This was not carelessness. The precision is too striking, the internal consistency too carefully maintained, for these to be simple errors or random exaggerations. The number 432,000 is not arbitrary. Scholars who study ancient Mesopotamian mathematics have noted that it is a multiple of 60, the base unit of the Sumerian counting system, the same system that gave us 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle. It is also connected to larger astronomical cycles that the Sumerians tracked with serious care. Some researchers have noted its relationship to the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that takes roughly 25,920 years to complete a single cycle. Multiply that number by certain values and 432,000 appears. Whether the scribes intended this, or whether the pattern was imposed much later by people looking for order in old numbers, is honestly still an open question. It is one the clay does not fully answer. What the clay does tell us, plainly and without drama, is that the people who produced this list lived inside a framework of time that was categorically different from ours. Not just longer, different in kind. The antediluvian rulers were not simply older kings who lived longer. They occupied a different layer of existence, one that the Sumerians called a time before the Great Flood changed the rules. Before that, different forces shaped the world. After it, things became recognisably human. Meanwhile, the physical reality of the prism itself carries its own kind of quiet weight. It is a four-sided column, roughly 11 inches tall. Each face is covered in close, careful cuneiform script. The wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay by the corner of a cut reed. The hand that made these marks was trained, patient, used to the feel of clay under pressure, used to the particular resistance of fresh river mud before it begins to stiffen. This was skilled work, done at a table or a low bench, probably by lamplight, in a city that believed deeply in the power of the written word to hold reality. Somewhere nearby, there would have been the sound of the city going on outside. The low voices of a market, perhaps, the movement of animals, the smell of the river in the morning air, that particular green mud smell that anyone who has spent time near a slow, old river will recognise without needing a description. And inside, someone bent over a piece of clay and pressed the names of kings who had been gone, by their own reckoning, for hundreds of thousands of years. There is something almost lonely about that image. Not sad, just quiet. Like a person standing at a window late at night, watching the empty street below, thinking about something they can't quite name. The scholars who first translated the Weld-Blundell Prism in the early 20th century did not know quite what to do with the antediluvian numbers. Some dismissed them immediately as mythological, which they may well be. The tablets record that kind of framing. Others tried to convert them into shorter spans using alternative mathematical systems. A few took the position, which still holds some quiet scholarly support today, that the enormous reigns may encode something real, a compressed record of dynasties, or ritual cycles, or astronomical periods, expressed in a numerical language we have not yet fully learned to read. None of these interpretations have fully settled the question. The prism holds its number with the same calm indifference it has always maintained. 432,000 years. 8 kings, 5 cities, and then the flood. It is worth noticing, before we move any further, that the Sumerians were not a people prone to fuzzy thinking. They built the first known cities. They developed writing independently, as far as we can tell, to serve the very practical needs of temple accounting. Recording grain, livestock, labour obligations. Their mathematics was sophisticated. Their astronomical records were among the most precise in the ancient world. These were not credulous storytellers, making things up to fill silence. They were administrators, builders, irrigators, and careful observers of the sky, which is what makes the king list so interesting. It was produced by the same culture that built the earliest known irrigation systems, the same scribal tradition that gave us the earliest legal codes, the same cities that first organised labour at scale. And it opens with 8 kings who lived before the flood and ruled the earth for 432,000 years. The contradiction is right there, and the Sumerians apparently saw no contradiction at all. For a while, the modern world tried to explain this gap away, to file it under myth and move on. But the more the ancient Near East has been excavated, the more it becomes clear that the Sumerians drew no firm line between their administrative records and their cosmic ones. Both were real. Both required careful preservation. Both were pressed into clay with the same patient hand. Now let us leave the quiet museum behind. Let us leave the glass case and the soft overhead light and the occasional footstep in the corridor. Let us step outside, into the wide flat dark of the Mesopotamian plain, 4,000 years before this prism was made, 6,000 years before tonight, into a landscape of low scrub and still water, and the first slow bends of rivers that had not yet been named, into the air before the first brick of the first city was laid, before the first reed stylus touched the first wet surface, into the silence before the record began. Now, let us look to where it all began. The plain stretches out in every direction, flat, dark, so still, let the stars reflect in the shallow water pooled between the reeds, and for a moment it is difficult to tell where the earth ends and the sky begins. This is the southern edge of Mesopotamia, the place the Sumerians would later call the beginning of all things. And tonight, standing here in the imagination, before the cities and the canals and the vast weight of organised civilization, it is easy to understand why. There is nowhere quieter than a marsh at night. The reeds shift slightly. The water holds its breath. Somewhere far off, a bird settles into the dark and does not move again. Modern archaeology has given this place a name. Tel Abu Sharain, a low mound in southern Iraq that rises gently above the surrounding plain, visible for miles in every direction simply because everything around it is so impossibly level. Excavations here began in the 19th century and continued through much of the 20th. What they found, layer by layer, going deeper into the earth, was a sequence of temple foundations, stacked one on top of the other, each one built directly over the ruins of the last. 18 distinct layers in total, reaching down to the very earliest levels of organised human settlement in the region. The deepest layers date to around 5,500 BCE, maybe earlier, and at the very bottom, the archaeologists found a small platform, carefully prepared, with the remnants of fish bones and ash scattered near what appears to have been an offering place. Someone had been here. Someone had built something small and deliberate in this spot, facing the water, tending a fire, leaving behind the quiet evidence of intention. That is Eridu. The Sumerians themselves were absolutely certain of what this place was. The king list opens with it. According to those earliest scribes, when kingship descended from heaven, it came first to Eridu, not to the larger, more famous cities that came later, not to or Uruk, to Eridu, the first, the foundation, the place where organised time began. And the tablets describe why, in their understanding, this particular location was chosen. Beneath Eridu, according to Sumerian belief, lay the Abzu, the great reservoir of fresh, sweet groundwater that the Sumerians believed ran beneath the entire world. Not a metaphor, or not only a metaphor. The Abzu, in their understanding, was a real body of deep water the source of all the rivers and all the springs, rising up in sacred places to meet the world above. And the Sumerians believed the Abzu was watched over, tended, lived in. We will come to that part in time. What would it have felt like to live in Eridu in those early centuries, long before writing, long before the great monuments? You would have woken to the sound of reeds. Not the distant rustling you might hear from a window, but the close, surrounding sound of hundreds of thousands of reed stalks moving together in the pre-dawn air. A low, soft sound like the breathing of something enormous and patient. Your shelter would have been made of the same reeds. Thick bundles bent and tied, sealed against the damp with mud from the riverbank. The floor would have been packed earth, slightly cool, slightly soft underfoot. The smell of the morning would have been green. That is the only word for it. The particular greenness of standing water and wet vegetation, and the dark mud that has been sitting in sunlight for months. It is not an unpleasant smell. It is a very old smell, one that the oldest parts of the human brain recognise as home. You would have eaten fish, most likely. The southern marshes of Mesopotamia have always been extraordinarily rich in fish. Carp, perch, catfish, moving through the reed beds in slow, quiet schools. You would have worked the water in flat reed boats, barely above the surface, feeling the resistance of the marsh push back against the pole in your hands. And at certain times of the year, you would have looked up at the sky. The Sumerians, who lived in these early settlements, were careful observers of the heavens, not yet in the formal mathematical way their descendants would become. That precision would come later with writing and accumulated records. But in the older, more instinctive way of people who live outside and who have no artificial light to drown out the stars, the sky above the Mesopotamian plain is enormous. On a clear night, it is overwhelming. The Milky Way cuts across it like a slow river of pale light, and every planet, every returning constellation, every predictable return of the moon is visible and unmistakable. They would have known the year by the sky, known the seasons, known when the floods were coming by the position of certain stars at certain times of night. This knowledge was not written down yet. It lived in the memory of the oldest people in the settlement, passed forward in careful words and repeated gestures. For a while, this was enough. The earliest shrine at Eridu was not large. The archaeologists who reached that bottom layer describe a simple mud brick platform, roughly rectangular, small enough that you could walk across it in a few paces. There may have been a low altar of some kind. There was certainly a space set aside from ordinary life, a place that was designated built it as different from the sleeping rooms and the cooking areas and the spaces where boats were stored. That designation matters. The act of setting a space apart, of drawing a line between the ordinary and the sacred, is one of the oldest things human beings do. It appears in every culture, in every corner of the world, often before writing, often before agriculture, often before cities. The need to mark certain ground, as belonging to something larger than the immediate moment. That need appears to be very deep and very old. At Eridu, it expressed itself in a platform above the water, in fish offered at a threshold, in the careful, repeated act of building one shrine directly on top of the ruins of the last, generation after generation, as if the location itself carried something that could not be moved or replaced. 18 layers, built up over millennia, each community returning to the same spot, rebuilding what had crumbled, tending what needed tending. There is something almost like a heartbeat in that image. Slow, patient, returning. What the very first inhabitants of Eridu called themselves, we do not know. They left no written record of their own name for their own people. That part of the story is simply gone. Not lost to violence or disaster, but faded in the ordinary way that things fade when there is no system yet to hold them. The Sumerians who came later, who built the great temples and filled the storerooms with tablets, may have been the direct descendants of these earliest marsh dwellers. Or they may have been a different people who arrived and inherited a sacred landscape already ancient when they found it. The archaeology does not yet give a clean answer. The layers go down, and at a certain depth they stop yielding names. And yet something was held. The location was remembered. The sanctity of the deep water beneath the city was carried forward. The belief in Eridu as the first place, the original ground, the point of beginning, that survived everything. It survived the rise of rival cities, the shifting of rivers, the long gaps of silence between one civilization and the next. Some things persist without fully knowing why. The water beneath Eridu moves slowly, if it moves at all, through layers of ancient stone and compressed sediment. In the Sumerian understanding, it flowed everywhere, connecting every sacred well, every spring, every place where fresh water met the dry earth and made things grow. And in that understanding, the one who kept the deep water was already there, already present beneath the marsh, already listening to the first footsteps on the platform above. The city had been waiting, quiet and deliberate, for the knowledge that was said to come from below. Something was coming from below. That is how the Sumerians understood it. Not from the mountains, not from the open sky, not from the distant edge of the known world. From below, from the deep, sweet water that ran beneath everything they had ever built or touched or stood upon. The city had been waiting, as we said, and in the Sumerian understanding, the waiting did not last forever. Enki is one of the oldest named presences in the Sumerian world. The tablets describe him in many ways across many centuries. As the shaper of rivers, the keeper of the sacred formulas that held civilization together, the one who sat in the deep water and listened to what the world above needed. In the Sumerian understanding, Enki was not a distant or unknowable force. He was close, practical, interested in the details of ordinary life in a way that other great powers were not. The scribes recorded that Enki was associated with wisdom in its most grounded form. Not wisdom as abstract thought, but wisdom as useful knowledge. The knowledge of how to lay a canal so that it carries water without silting. How to store grain so that it survives the humid season. How to build a wall that will still be standing when the rains come. How to read the position of certain stars and know, weeks in advance, when the river will flood. In the Sumerian worldview, these things did not develop slowly through generations of human trial and error. They were given, delivered, sent up from the Abzu in the form of teachers. The Apkallu. The scribes recorded them as 7 in number, the 7 primordial sages sent to humanity before the Great Flood, each one associated with a particular king from that original list, each one arriving in a specific ancient city to pass on a specific form of knowledge. They are described in the tablets as part human and part fish, or wearing the skin of a fish, or emerging from water, which has fascinated readers and scholars for a very long time and probably means something more than it appears to on the surface. What that something is, the tablets do not say plainly. The first of the 7 is named Ioanna in some sources, or Oannis in the later Greek retellings that filtered these stories through a different language and a different time. He is described as the one who brought the foundations, the first and most essential knowledge that made organised life possible. Not a single craft or skill, but the whole shape of it. The Sumerians believed that before Ioanna, human beings knew how to survive, but not how to live together deliberately. They gathered, they ate, they sheltered, but the particular kind of organised, intentional existence that produces cities, that was different. Scribes recorded that Ioanna taught humans to build with brick, to lay foundations, to measure land, to calculate, to set aside food beyond what was needed for a single day, to recognise and record the patterns of the sky. These things, in the Sumerian understanding, arrived together as a single gift delivered at the edge of the marsh by something that rose from the water at dawn and walked among people during the day and returned to the deep at night. there is a quality to that image that is worth sitting with. The teacher who comes from somewhere entirely different from the place it teaches, who participates fully in the daylight world, talking, demonstrating, guiding hands through difficult work, and then withdraws completely, who does not stay, who is present during the learning and absent during the night, as if the knowledge itself be encountered in ordinary daylight, in ordinary human bodies, doing ordinary human work, in order to take root. That is not the image of a conqueror or a ruler. It is the image of a craftsman's teacher, patient, precise, interested in whether the hand is holding the tool correctly. Think for a moment about what it would have meant to receive the knowledge of the brick. Mud brick is simple enough in concept. River clay, pressed into a mould, dried in the sun, but the details matter enormously. The right ratio of clay to sand so that it does not crack as it dries. The right thickness so that a wall built from it will carry out weight without collapsing. The alignment of courses so that the joints are staggered and no single line of weakness runs from top to bottom. The curing time. The protection from rain during drying. The difference between sun-dried brick for interior walls and fired brick for foundations that will sit in damp ground. A person could spend years learning this by failure alone, building walls that crumble, mixing clay that splits, laying courses that lean and fall. Or they could be shown, once, carefully by someone who already knew. The Sumerians believed they were shown, and the result over the following centuries was extraordinary. Mud brick constructions spread across Mesopotamia with a uniformity and sophistication that still impresses archaeologists. The early temples at Eridu, at Uruk, at they are built with a competence that does not look like early experimentation. They look like the work of people who learned from a clear, coherent tradition. Where that tradition began and how it spread so consistently remains one of those questions that the archaeology raises without quite answering. Meanwhile, the canals were being dug. The gift of water management was perhaps the most consequential of all the things the Apkallu were believed to have brought. The rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates, were extraordinarily generous but also unpredictable. They flooded in spring, sometimes violently, and ran low in summer. The land between them was among the richest in the world, but only if you could control where the water went. That's why the scribes recorded that Enki, in their understanding, was the one who first divided the rivers, who set the courses of water so that fields could be irrigated in dry months and drained when the floods came. They believed this was not a human achievement, but a cosmic one, a design. The canals did not happen, because enough people tried and failed and eventually figured it out. They happened because the shape of the water was shown to them by someone who understood it completely. What is easy to overlook in the long view of history is how deeply strange and sudden this must have seemed to the people living through it. One generation is working the marsh the same way. The next generation is living in a city with granaries and a temple, and a system of channels that keeps the fields productive through the dry season. From inside that change, it might genuinely have felt like something had arrived. Something that had not been there before. The human mind, encountering change it cannot fully explain, tends to reach for the nearest frame that makes sense. And in the Sumerian frame, the nearest explanation was also the most natural one. The deep water had sent someone up to help. The Apkallu appear not only in the Eridu Genesis and the King List, but in a much later Babylonian text. A cuneiform document known by scholars as the Uruk list of kings and sages, which pairs each antediluvian king with his corresponding sage. The list is matter-of-fact in tone, no more dramatic than a record of temple inventories. 7 kings, 7 sages, 7 pairs. Each one representing an era of learning, an era of guidance, the long, slow accumulation of everything that would eventually become the civilization we are now reconstructing from fragments. After the flood, the tablets record, the sages changed. They became part human, no longer the full Apkallu, who were believed to have been divine teachers in the Sumerian understanding, but something more like human scholars who carried the old knowledge forward in diminished form. The great gift had been given. What remained was the task of preserving it. That task fell to the scribes, to the temples, to the patient hands pressing stylus into clay by lamplight in rooms that smelled of damp stone and sesame oil. And gradually, over the long centuries, those hands would press into the clay the stories of the very teachers who had, in their understanding, made writing possible in the first place. There is something almost circular in that, a kind of quiet, patient loop. Knowledge given, knowledge of the giving, preserved forever in the medium that the giving made possible. The first of the 7 sages is now a name in a handful of surviving texts. A figure described, in the words of later Babylonian scholars, as one who clarified the plans of heaven and earth, who illuminated everything, who had no equal among the 7. He arrived at the edge of the marsh. He walked in the world during the light. He returned to the deep at night, and somewhere in the southern plain, in the slow air above the first city, the knowledge he brought was already beginning to take its permanent shape in stone and clay and water. The knowledge had arrived. Now came the slower work of making it stay. That is what the early priests were for in the Sumerian understanding. Not to perform spectacle or to accumulate power, to repeat, to maintain, to ensure that the things which had been learned were practiced again the following morning, and the morning after that, until the repetition itself became a kind of memory that lived in the body rather than only in the mind. Adapa was the first of them. The tablets describe Adapa, who some scholars have suggested may be the same figure as Uana, the first Apkallu, in terms that are careful and specific. He served in the temple at Eridu. He performed the rites. He maintained the offerings. He baked the bread that was placed before the altar, and he poured the water, and he swept the floor of the sanctuary with the same unhurried attention he gave to everything else. These are not the actions of a remote, unknowable presence. They are the actions of someone doing the early morning work of a temple before the rest of the city is awake. And yet the tablets also describe Adapa as something more than an ordinary priest. In the Sumerian understanding, he was the one through whom the first sacred language passed, the naming of things, the assignment of words to the objects and forces of the world, so that people could speak about them precisely, could record them, could pass them forward without distortion. There is a kind of power in naming that is easy to underestimate. A field without a name is just ground. A field with a name, a designated boundary, a recorded measurement, that is property. That is a legal entity. That can be inherited, divided, sold, taxed, protected. The name is not just a label, it is the thing's entry into the organised world. Adapa, in the Sumerian understanding, presided over that transition. The moving of things from the unnamed dark into the spoken, recorded light. The physical image of the Apkallu has survived in a form that outlasted even the cuneiform tablets describing them. In the art of later Assyrian palaces, the great carved stone panels that lined the corridors of kings like Ashurbanipal and Sennacherib, figures appear repeatedly in a specific pose and a specific garment. They are human in shape, but dressed in the skin of a fish, the fish's head worn as a hood, the scaled body hanging down the back like a cloak. They stand beside sacred trees. They hold containers of water and a kind of cone, perhaps a purification tool. Their expressions, where the stone has been preserved well enough to read them, are calm, unhurried. These are the Apkallu, still present in Assyrian art 1,000 years after the last cuneiform reference to Adapa, still recognisable, still performing, in carved stone, the same quiet acts of tending and purifying and standing watch beside sacred objects. The fish garment has interested scholars for a long time. The most straightforward reading is simply that it marks the Apkallu as beings of the deep water, wearing the substance of the Abzu as an outer skin, carrying the identity of their origin, even while walking in the world above. But the garment also reads, in a quieter way, as a uniform, a sign of office, the way a doctor might wear a white coat or a craftsman an apron, not just to identify what they are, but to signal the shift from ordinary person to person in function. When Adapa put on the fish garment, he became, in the Sumerian understanding, the channel between the deep knowledge and the world that needed it. Over time, this became the template for the priest. There is something about early ritual that the modern world tends to misread. We often think of ancient religious practice as mysterious, emotionally overwhelming, designed to produce awe or fear, and some of it was. But a great deal of it, perhaps most of it, in the daily life of early Mesopotamian temples was simply quiet, repetitive, careful work. The lighting of the lamp at the same time each morning, the sweeping of the threshold, the preparation of the offering bread in the specific way that had been shown in the specific vessels, set down in the specific order, the pouring of water from a clean vessel into a clean bowl, the incantation spoken at the same point in the sequence, in the same words, without abbreviation. These are not the actions of ecstasy. They are the actions of craft, and their purpose was not primarily to impress anyone. Their purpose was to hold a structure in place through the reliable repetition of correct form. The Sumerians believed, in their understanding, that the world required this kind of maintenance, that the cosmic order, the me, the sacred formulas that governed every aspect of existence from kingship to bread baking to the proper way to mourn the dead, was not self-sustaining. It needed to be renewed, enacted again in the correct form, by the correct person at the correct time, and Adapa was the one who first established how that was done. Somewhere in Cornwall tonight, perhaps someone is lying in the quiet listening to these words and finding something unexpectedly familiar in them. Eleanor might recognise it, the comfort of a routine performed so many times it no longer requires thought. A cup of tea made in the same order every evening, the same chair, the same window, the same particular quality of dark outside. Repetition as a form of safety. The body knowing what comes next before the mind does. The scribes who maintained the memory of Adapa understood this. They copied his name across centuries, passing it from one generation of temple scribes to the next, through the Akkadian period and the Babylonian period, and, eventually, into the libraries of the Assyrian kings. His name changed slightly in the transmission. Uana became Adapa. Adapa was sometimes rendered Uan. The fish garment was sometimes described differently. Some details were dropped, others were added, but the essential shape remained. The first sage, the priest of Eridu, the one who named things and set the order of the rites and baked the bread and stood at the threshold between the deep water and the world of ordinary human days. That shape persisted because it described something true about early organised life. Someone has to be the first to establish the form. Someone has to perform it long enough that others learn it by watching. Someone has to care enough about its preservation to teach it carefully to the next person and to the next. There is a fragment of a longer Adapa text, partial, damaged, reconstructed from several separate tablet copies found in Egypt and Iraq and Turkey. That gives a slightly different dimension to the figure. In this text, the tablets describe Adapa as possessing something called the tongue of the city, which is a beautiful phrase and probably means something quite specific in the original Sumerian. The official voice, the authorized speech, the language that carried legal and ritual force rather than just ordinary meaning. The tongue of the city, the words that bind things together, the formulas that make a marriage, or a transfer of land a legal transfer, or a temple rather than just a building. Someone has to speak them. Someone has to hold them correctly. someone has to know them well enough to deploy them without error at the exact moment they are needed. That was Adapa's function in the Sumerian understanding. And it is a function that never disappeared. It simply changed its name across the centuries, moved through different languages and different traditions, and arrived in diminished but still recognisable form in every organised society the world has since produced. The early priest of Eridu and the notary public who witnessed a deed in the 20th century are further apart in time than the mind can easily hold. But the function is the same. The tongue of the city, speaking the words that make things officially real. And yet for all the careful preservation of his name and his image, Adapa himself remains a figure seen only partially. The oldest layers of his story, the 3rd millennium BCE traditions that preceded even the earliest surviving texts, are gone. What we have are copies of copies, filtered through centuries of retelling, translated across at least 3 different languages, absorbed into traditions that remade him slightly each time they touched him. What the people of Eridu in 3500 BCE actually believed about Adapa in their own words and their own understanding is not fully recoverable. The tablets that might have told us have not been found. They may have been destroyed in the collapse of cities, dissolved in flooding, scattered and lost across millennia of accumulated erasure. What remains is the outline, the fish garment, the temple at Eridu, the bread and the water and the swept threshold, the name persisting in clay long after the man, or the presence, or the story, whatever Adapa truly was, had passed entirely out of living memory. And from that outline, slowly, over many centuries, the great span of time he was said to have witnessed begins to come into focus. 40,000 years, by some reckonings, passed between the arrival of the first sage and the coming of the flood. 40,000 years of temple mornings, of swept floors and poured water, and bread set out in the correct position on the altar. The mind drifts forward into that stretch of time, and then quiets, and then simply lets it pass. 40,000 years of temple mornings. The mind sets that down and moves forward, into the reign of the first king, Alulim. The name sits quietly in the clay, neither loud nor obscure, just a name, the first name on the oldest list. King of Eridu, according to the tablets, for 28,800 years. There is a particular quality that very large numbers have when you stop trying to comprehend them and simply let them rest. The number stops being a quantity and starts being something else. A texture, a colour, a weight. 28,800 years. The scribes who carved that number did not seem troubled by it. They set it down in the same orderly cuneiform they used for grain counts and field measurements. The sign for years, the sign for the number, a clean, matter-of-fact record, no different in tone from a temple inventory. That is worth noticing. The people who produced the king list were not, as far as the evidence suggests, trying to mystify anyone. They were trying to document, and in their understanding, the numbers they wrote were accurate. The reign of Alulim lasted 28,800 years, and that was simply how long it lasted, and the scribe's job was to record it correctly and move on to the next entry. There is something oddly calming about that kind of certainty. To sit with Alulim's reign for a moment, not to calculate it or dispute it, but simply to feel the shape of it, is to encounter a very different experience of time than the one we normally carry. We tend to think of history in the spans we can almost hold, a century, a few generations. 400 or 500 years covers the distance between a living person and something that feels genuinely old. 1,000 years starts to feel unreachable. 5,000 years, the edge of written history, is already the kind of number that makes the mind go slightly blank. 28,000 years is more than 5 times that. It is longer than the time between us and the last great ice age in the northern hemisphere, longer than the period separating the earliest cave paintings in Europe from tonight. It is a span so deep that it contains within it the entirety of what we normally call human history, several times over. And in the Sumerian king list, that is just the first reign of the first king, of the first city. 7 more reigns follow before the flood comes. 7 more stretches of time, each one measured in thousands of years, most of them longer than the last. The total, 432,000 years, is not an accumulation of dramatic events. It is an accumulation of mornings, of seasons, of the river rising and falling and rising again, of grain stored and bread baked and lamps lit and swept thresholds. Stability so complete it approaches stillness. Over time, this became the foundational idea. The political theology of early Mesopotamia, the belief system that justified and explained kingship, was built on a very specific premise. The tablets record that kingship was not a human invention. It was not something a community decided to try. According to the earliest scribes, it descended from the sky. It was given, set in place, and the king who received it was not simply a strong man or a capable administrator. He was the earthly holder of something cosmic, a position that had existed before him, would exist after him, and required the correct person in the correct place for the world to remain ordered. The Sumerians believed, in their understanding, that when kingship was functioning properly, when the right king sat on the throne, performed the right rites, maintained the right relationships with the temples, the world held together. The floods came at the right time and in the right measure. The grain grew, the cities ran smoothly, the distant stars moved in their expected patterns. And when kingship failed, when it was seized wrongly, or held badly, or moved from one city to another through violence, the world became unstable. The rain fell wrong. The rivers shifted. Things that should have stayed in place began to drift. This is not a metaphor, or not only a metaphor. The Sumerians appear to have believed this quite literally. The well-being of the natural world and the correctness of human governance were not separate systems. They were the same system. And the king was the hinge between them, which makes the vast reigns of the antediluvian kings read differently, once you understand that frame. A reign of 28,000 years is not about one person living that long. It is about the world remaining stable for that long. It is about kingship functioning so correctly, so continuously, in such perfect alignment with the cosmic order that nothing needed to change. No upheaval, no transfer of power, no disruption to the slow, vast rhythm of the seasons and the river and the sky. The numbers are not about longevity, they are about peace. Alongside Alulim in that long reign stood his corresponding sage, the first of the Apkallu, the 2 figures moving in quiet parallel through a span of time that the mind can only gesture at rather than truly enter. The king holding the earthly order, the sage holding the knowledge that kept it intelligible. Between them, something like a complete world, organised, maintained, endlessly repeated. There is a kind of mathematics in this arrangement that the Sumerians appear to have found deeply satisfying. Not just the specific numbers, though those mattered, but the structure itself. The pairing of ruler and teacher. The balance of political authority and deep knowledge. The sense that no single power, however vast, could function without the other. That balance appears throughout Mesopotamian thought in different forms across different centuries. The king who builds without consulting the temple brings disaster. The scholar who holds knowledge without a ruler to implement it watches it go unused. Both were incomplete alone. Both were necessary. The pairing of Alulim and the first sage, in the Sumerian understanding, the ideal form of that arrangement. Not yet complicated by ambition or scarcity or the grinding pressures of competing cities. Just the clean initial form. 2 offices, 1 purpose. An act to suggest expanse of time long enough to suggest that when things are arranged correctly, they can stay that way almost indefinitely. Scholars studying the specific numbers in the king list have noted carefully and with appropriate uncertainty that many of them appear to be multiples of common Sumerian numerical units. The base 60 counting system that the Sumerians did, a system whose echoes we still use every time we divide an hour into 60 minutes, generates numbers with distinctive patterns, multiples of 3 to 600, of 7 to 200, of 36,000. The reigns of the antediluvian kings cluster around these values in ways that look to trained eyes less like records of actual duration and more like carefully constructed numerical compositions. Some researchers have suggested connections to astronomical cycles, the movement of particular planets, the recurring alignment of certain constellations, the great slow wobble of the Earth's axis that takes tens of thousands of years to complete. Others have proposed that the numbers encode symbolic relationships between the cities and their rulers, a kind of mathematical cosmology in which the proportions of power are expressed as proportions of time. None of these interpretations have settled the question. The tablets do not explain their own mathematics. They simply present the numbers with that same level, administrative calm, and leave the reader to make of them what they will. What the reader can say with confidence is that the numbers were deliberate. Someone chose them. Someone arranged them in this particular sequence, with these particular values, so that they would add to exactly 432,000 years, and not some other total. That precision is not accidental. It is a statement, a claim. A structure built as carefully as the temples whose foundations the archaeologists have uncovered, layer by layer, going deeper into the earth. The world those numbers describe is, in a strange way, deeply restful. A world that does not change, where the same king sits the same city, under the same sky, for longer than the human imagination can comfortably hold, where the sage rises each morning and performs the same rites in the same order, and the lamp is lit at the same time, and the bread is set out, and the threshold is swept, where the flood has not yet come, and the cities have not yet fallen, and the knowledge has not yet been lost, and partially recovered, and partially lost again. A world of unbroken mourning. The scribes who compiled and recopied the king list were living in a world already very different from that one. They knew about the flood. It was recorded a few lines below the antediluvian section, the abrupt transition to shorter rains and recognisable cities, and the beginning of the kind of history that looks more like ours. They were writing in the aftermath of that change, in a world of competing powers and shifting borders, and the constant slow pressure of entropy on everything people had built. And they were looking back into the vast stillness before the flood, before the disruption, into the long, unhurried era when the numbers were enormous because the peace was enormous, and the world, in the Sumerian understanding, held its shape. That, looking back, is the quietest part of the king list. The numbers themselves are what you notice first, but what sits beneath them is something simpler, a longing for the deep stability that the pre-flood era represented, a belief that such stability was real, was possible, had once existed in this world before something changed. The clay that holds those numbers is now in a glass case in Oxford, in a room where the air barely moves. Around it, outside the museum walls, the city goes on. Traffic. Voices. The ordinary noise of a world still very much in motion. Inside, the numbers wait. Patient as river clay. Calm as a swept threshold at first light. The rooms where those numbers were first compiled. The quiet, scribal chambers of Nippur, perhaps, or or some other city whose name appears in the list itself, are now under the earth. Under centuries of accumulated silence. Under the same flat, dark plain we stood in at the beginning of this story, before the first brick was laid. The hands that pressed these numbers into clay have been gone for 4,000 years. But the numbers remain. And somewhere, a few letters down on the prism, the story begins to shift. The flood is coming. Not tonight. Not yet. But it is written into the clay, just below where we are standing. The flood is written into the clay, just below where we are standing. But before we reach it, there is something worth pausing on. The clay itself. Not the story pressed into it, not the kings or the sages or the vast spans of years, just the clay, the process of it, the patient, daily, unhurried work of the people who kept the whole record alive. Nippur sits roughly in the middle of the Mesopotamian plain, equidistant from the great rivers, neither in the dry north nor the wet south. It was not, for most of its history, a city of kings. It did not produce great military dynasties or leave its mark on the land through conquest. What it produced over several thousand years was writing, texts, tablets, lists and hymns and legal documents and mathematical problems and mythological cycles and copies of even older texts whose originals had already crumbled by the time the Nippur scribes set their reeds to clay. The ruins of Nippur have yielded more cuneiform tablets than almost any other site in Mesopotamia, tens of thousands of them, excavated across more than a century of archaeological work, representing an extraordinary range of content and an equally extraordinary range of skill level. From the polished, clean hands of senior temple scribes to the uncertain, slightly uneven strokes of students still learning the basic signs. That range matters. It tells you that Nippur was not just a place where documents were stored. It was a place where scribes were made. The Eduba was what the Sumerians called the place of learning. The tablet house. Scholars have reconstructed something of what it looked and felt like from a combination of archaeological remains and, usefully, from the tablets themselves, some of which describe school life in direct and sometimes surprisingly dry terms. Students complained about difficult lessons. Teachers commented on poor work. Lists of words and signs were copied out hundreds of times. The repetition served the same purpose it serves in any long apprenticeship: to move knowledge from the effortful mind into the automatic hand. The room itself would have been cool, probably. Thick mud brick walls keep heat out as effectively as any modern insulation. And the rooms of ancient Mesopotamian buildings were often dim even in full daylight, the small high windows letting in enough light to work by without allowing in the full weight of the southern sun. There would have been a particular smell. Damp earth, primarily. Fresh clay has a clean, mineral quality to it. Not unpleasant. Closer to the smell of rain on dry stone than anything rotting or heavy. Mixed into that, perhaps, the smoke of oil lamps burning in the corner. The dry warmth of bodies in a concentrated space. The almost imperceptible sound of reed on clay. A soft, precise scratch repeat at irregular intervals across a room of working hands. Not loud, not eventful, just the quiet industry of people doing careful work. The clay for the tablets was gathered from the river. It needed to be the right kind of clay. Smooth enough to take a clear impression, plastic enough to hold a shape, without cracking, fine-grained enough that the individual wedge marks would remain distinct and readable after drying. River clay in Mesopotamia tends toward these qualities naturally, but preparation still mattered. The raw clay was washed to remove coarser particles, kneaded until it reached the right consistency, worked with wet hands until it was smooth throughout and free of air pockets. Then shaped. Most tablets are roughly palm-sized, small enough to be held in one hand while the other works the stylus, large enough to hold a useful amount of text. The scribe shaped the lump into a slightly cushioned rectangle, convex on one side to give a stable working surface, rounded at the edges to prevent the corners from breaking off as the clay dried. Then the stylus, cut from a reed, the end trimmed at an angle, to produce a point that was not quite round and not quite square, but somewhere between, capable of making the characteristic wedge marks of cuneiform script when pressed at the right angle and depth. The marks were not drawn, they were pressed. A single deliberate push of the reed into the soft surface, then lifted, then repositioned, then pressed again. Each character built from a small number of these wedge impressions, combined in different arrangements to produce different signs. A practiced hand could move quickly. A student's hand was slower, more deliberate, pressing each mark with visible effort, checking the angle, correcting the depth. For a while, the learning simply continued. What the students of the Adapa were copying in their daily exercises was not always simple material. Alongside basic vocabulary lists and multiplication tables, they copied literary and mythological texts, hymns, laments, cosmological narratives. The king list appears among the practice tablets recovered from several Mesopotamian sites, in multiple copies of varying completeness and quality. Some clearly the work of accomplished scribes, others bearing the hesitation marks of students still uncertain of their signs. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it changes what the king list is. It is not just a document, it is a curriculum, something considered important enough to teach. A text that young scribes in training were expected to know, to copy, to reproduce correctly, which means the antediluvian kings, Alulim and Alalgar and Enmen-Luana and all the others, were not just names on an administrative record. They were names that every trained scribe in the Sumerian tradition would have known. Part of the basic literacy of the culture, as familiar in their world as the names of the oldest founding figures in any civilization's founding story. The flood was part of this curriculum too. The list of post-flood kings. The gradual shortening of reigns as the story moved from myth toward recognizable history. It was all one document, taught as one document, preserved as one coherent arc from the very beginning of organized time to the more recent past. And the people who taught it, who copied it, who passed it from one generation of students to the next. Most of them have no names. The anonymity of the Nippur scribes is complete, for the most part. A few senior temple officials are known by name from other documents. A handful of scribes signed their work, as scholars sometimes did in the later periods. But the vast majority of the people who sat in those cool, dim rooms and pressed the king list into fresh clay, morning after morning, year after year, across centuries, left no personal trace at all. Their personalities, their specific beliefs about the texts they were copying, their private thoughts about the impossible numbers they were reproducing with such careful precision, all of that is simply gone. What remains is their handwriting. And in a quiet way, that is enough. The handwriting of a careful scribe is not impersonal. You can see the hand in it, the slight forward lean of one person's strokes, the consistent depth of another's impressions, the evidence of someone who pressed the stylus with exactly the same force every time, never varying. The small irregularities that accumulate over a long session, the signs that were cleaner at the start of the tablet, slightly looser toward the end, when the hand had been working for hours, and the clay had begun to stiffen. These are not abstract marks. They are traces of a specific body doing a specific thing on a specific afternoon. Meanwhile, the text those hands were copying was already ancient by the time they touched it. Already a record of something that felt, even to them, impossibly remote. There is something profound in the chain of it, when you let yourself feel the full length. Someone in the early Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, copies a list that was already old. A list whose origins reach back into the 3rd millennium, into traditions that predate even the earliest surviving written versions. That scribe's copy is later found in the ground of Nippur, or or some other Mesopotamian city, by archaeologists working in the 19th or 20th century CE. It is cleaned and catalogued and translated and eventually placed in a museum or stored in a university archive, where it is read by scholars who produce papers that are read by other scholars, and so on forward until the chain reaches tonight. The act of preservation is always a chain of quiet, individual choices. Someone chose to make this copy. Someone chose to keep it. Someone chose to excavate carefully rather than carelessly. Someone chose to translate honestly and completely. And here we are, at the end of a very long line, still receiving what those unnamed hands in those cool, dim rooms sent forward without knowing exactly where it was going. The clay remembers. Long after the rooms that held it have dissolved back into the plain. Somewhere beyond Nippur, further north and further into the centuries that follow, grander buildings were rising, rooms with higher ceilings and deeper archives. Kings who understood, perhaps more consciously than anyone before them, that the clay tablets of the old world were not just records, they were the inherited memory of civilization itself. And some of those kings went to extraordinary lengths to gather that memory into one place and hold it. Some of those kings went to extraordinary lengths. But before we reach the great halls where the sages were carved in stone, there is a smaller room to stand in first. A quieter discovery. A tablet that most people have never heard of in a city whose ruins have been returning their secrets to the surface for over a century. Uruk, the site known today as Warka in southern Iraq, was once one of the largest cities in the ancient world. At its peak, somewhere around 3000 BCE, it may have housed tens of thousands of people within walls that stretched for miles across the flat plain. It had temples and workshops and administrative centres and a canal system and a tradition of monumental construction that influenced every major city that came after it. In the story of early Mesopotamia, Uruk is one of the defining places, the city that in many ways defined what a city was. And it appears in the king list, just as Eridu does. After kingship moved from Eridu, it came to Bad Tibira, and then to Larak, and then to Sippar, and then to Shuruppak, and then the flood came. After the flood, kingship moved again, settling into different cities across different eras. Kish, Uruk, the great names of the ancient world, each one holding the centre of power for a time, and then losing it to the next. The ruins of Uruk are enormous and not yet fully excavated. Work there has been going on since the late 19th century, conducted at different periods by German archaeological teams, and the site continues to yield material that changes what we know about the earliest urban world. In 1969, amid the ongoing excavations, a tablet was found that did something no other known tablet had done quite so explicitly. Scholars refer to it by its excavation number W.20030-7. Not the most poetic name, but the content of the tablet, once carefully cleaned and read, was striking in its specificity. It is a list. Like so many Mesopotamian documents, it is simply a list. But what this list records is the pairing, directly, unambiguously, in clean cuneiform columns, of each antediluvian king with his corresponding sage. Alulim and Uana, the first king and the first Apkallu, standing together in the clay as they stood together, in the Sumerian understanding, through the first and longest reign in history, and so on down the list, king by king and sage by sage, through the 5 pre-flood cities, through the 7 pairs of ruler and teacher, until the tablet reaches the flood and stops, or rather, until the tablet breaks. The physical condition of the Uruk tablet is what you would expect of something that spent roughly 2,000 years in the ground under a collapsed building in southern Iraq. Parts of it are intact, parts of it are missing. The edges have crumbled in the irregular way that unfired or lightly fired clay crumbles. Not cleanly, not in one place, but gradually, corner by corner, edge by edge, until a section that once held text now holds only a jagged absence. Scholars who work with damaged tablets develop a particular patience for this kind of loss. They learn to read around the gaps, to use context and comparison to recover what the missing sections probably said, to note carefully what can be stated with confidence and what can only be inferred. The Uruk tablet, in places, can be reconstructed by comparison with other king lists and sage lists from other sites. In other places, the missing portions are simply missing, and the reconstructed lineage has to stop and acknowledge its own edges. There is something honest about that. The broken tablet does not pretend to completeness. It offers what it has, and holds its gaps openly without apology. The scribes who made it, working perhaps in the final centuries BCE, when Uruk was still a functioning city with an active temple tradition, were themselves working from older sources. The list they were compiling was already ancient by the time they pressed it into clay. They were not recording something they had witnessed. They were transmitting something that had come down to them through a chain of copies and oral tradition and institutional memory. And they were adding their own careful link to that chain before the city itself began its final long decline. Over time, the city quieted. The last Babylonian period. The spread of Greek influence across the region after Alexander. The slow thinning of the old scribal traditions. The moment, not marked by any single event, but arriving nonetheless, when no one in Uruk could read the oldest signs anymore, and the temples fell into disuse, and the plain reclaimed what had been built on it, and the tablet went into the ground. What the Uruk list gives us that the king list does not, or not as explicitly, is the relational structure. Not just the names, but the pairing. The insistence that each king had a sage, and that the sage was as essential to the era as the king. The two-column arrangement of the text, ruler on one side, teacher on the other, makes a visual argument that the written words reinforce. These are not separate stories. They are one story told in parallel, each side incomplete, without the other. The scribes who arranged the text this way understood something about how knowledge moves through time. It does not travel alone. It requires a carrier. And the carriers the Uruk tablet memorializes are not the powerful, not the famous, not the ones whose names ended up on monuments. They are the teachers, the advisors. The figures standing slightly to one side of the throne, holding the older and quieter kind of authority. In later Babylonian tradition, the tablets tell us the Apkallu were invoked not just as historical figures, but as active protective presences. Small figurines in the shape of the fish-garbed sages were buried in the foundations and walls of houses and temples, placed there to guard the structure and the people inside it. The same calm figures carved in stone on the palace walls of Assyrian kings appeared in miniature beneath the floors of ordinary homes. The protective function that the Apkallu represented in cosmic terms. The maintenance of order against chaos was translated into domestic terms. A figure in the wall, standing watch through the night. That transition from mythological figure to household guardian is a journey the Uruk tablet sits somewhere in the middle of. By the time W2037 was inscribed, the Apkallu were probably both things simultaneously. Historical sages from the distant past and active spiritual guardians in present-day belief. The tablet pairing them with the antediluvian kings was not simply archival. It was also, in some sense, an act of preservation that carried a protective intent. To record the names correctly was to keep the presences alive. The missing portions of the tablet are hard not to think about. The text breaks off mid-list. Some of the Sage King pairings are recoverable from comparison texts. Others are not. There are sages whose names we have from one source and not another. Kings whose sage companions are noted in some lists and absent from others. Gaps in the lineage that the archaeology has not yet filled and may never fill. What was written there, in the sections now crumbled and lost, is simply not recoverable. The people who could have read those sections. The last trained scribes of Uruk, working in the last years of the city's long tradition, are themselves gone. The knowledge they held in their heads, the oral supplements to the written record, the explanation terms they could have given for the fragments and the unusual readings, and the variant spellings, all of that dissolved when the tradition dissolved. The gap in the tablet is not just physical. It is the shape of everything that did not make it forward, and yet the tablet itself made it. The parts that survived completely. The pairs that were recorded in the intact sections are as clear today as they were the day they were pressed, despite the ground and the centuries and all the accumulated weight of everything that happened in the time between. Somewhere to the north and west, in the great stone corridors of Assyrian palaces, The sages had by then been given a different kind of permanence. Not clay that could crumble, stone. Carved deep into walls, several tons in weight, images that would require sustained effort to destroy, and that, buried under enough earth, could wait out almost anything. The tablets break. The stones endure a little longer. Stone endures differently than clay. Clay holds an impression and waits. It is patient in the way that soft things are patient, yielding, absorbent, capable of receiving almost anything pressed into it. But it depends on circumstances, on dryness, on the absence of water, the absence of crushing weight, the absence of the 10,000 small disasters that end most things. Stone is less accommodating and more stubborn. You do not press a mark into stone. You take something away. You cut down into the surface, removing what was there to reveal what you intended. And what is left is harder than the original inscription by the very act of having been made. The Assyrian kings understood this. They understood it in the way that powerful people often understand the relationship between materials and permanence. Which is to say, they used it deliberately, on a very large scale, with considerable thought given to what they wanted to last. The palaces of Nimrud and Nineveh are, by any measure, staggering places. The rooms were vast. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with carved alabaster panels, a soft cream-coloured stone that takes detail well and reflects lamplight in a way that makes a room glow slightly, even at night. The figures carved into those panels were not small or tentative. They were life-sized and larger, their proportions slightly idealised in the way of formal Assyrian art. Broad, shoulders, calm faces, the deliberate musculature of beings who are powerful and know it. Walking through those corridors, even now in the museums where the surviving panels have been reassembled, there is a quality to the experience that is hard to describe without sounding slightly dramatic. The figures stand at a height slightly above eye level. They face you, or face slightly away, absorbed in their eternal tasks. They are not threatening. That is what you notice first. The scale is imposing, but the expressions are composed, and the gestures are precise and purposeful. The raised hand holding a cone, the other hand cradling a bucket, the attention directed somewhere specific and important and entirely calm. These are the Apkallu, not the names in the clay, not the abstract figures paired with antediluvian kings in a 2-column list. These are the sages made physical, made permanent, translated from the scribal tradition into the visual language of the most powerful empire of their age. The Assyrian kings who commissioned these images were not simply decorating their walls. The carving of Apkallu figures in specific positions throughout a palace was, in their understanding, a functional act. The figures were placed at doorways and thresholds, and along the routes connecting the most important rooms, not at random, but according to a logic that the scholars who have studied the palace layouts believe was deliberate and consistent. The protective beings stood at the points where something might enter, at transitions between spaces, at the places where, in the ancient understanding, the boundary between the ordered interior and the unordered exterior was thinnest. They believed these figures held the power to stand watch at those boundaries, to maintain the distinction between inside and outside, between safety and threat, between the organised world and whatever lay beyond its edges. This is an old idea, much older than the Assyrian Empire. The Sumerians had placed protective figures at thresholds too, smaller, made of clay or less permanent materials, but serving the same function. The Apkallu were the logical candidates for this role, not only because they were powerful presences in the old tradition, but because their entire purpose in the Sumerian understanding was precisely this: the maintenance of order, the holding of the world together, the presence that kept things from sliding back into chaos. By the time the Assyrian kings were building Nimrud and Nineveh, the Apkallu had been performing this function symbolically for well over 1,000 years. The palace reliefs were the grandest expression of that ongoing role. But they were not the only expression. Alongside the massive stone figures in the royal corridors, a parallel tradition existed at a much more domestic scale. Archaeologists excavating ordinary houses from the Neo-Assyrian period have found, beneath the floors and within the walls, small clay figurines in the shape of the fish-garbed sages. They are typically palm-sized, carefully made but not elaborate, the work of craftsmen producing objects in quantity for a market that clearly wanted them. They were placed in specific locations according to what appear to have been standard instructions, some of which have found recorded on tablets describing the correct procedures for protecting a house. The tablets record that these figures were believed to stand guard in the hidden spaces of the structure itself, in the walls, beneath the thresholds, under the floors where people walked and slept. The Apkallu were present in the foundation, in the literal material of the house, as unseen protectors working their function from below. The same logic that placed Adapa at the threshold between the deep water and the light world was operating here. The sages belonged in the in-between places, in the margins, in the quiet, unseen spaces where ordinary attention does not fall. David in Vancouver, who works with old archives and knows the particular piece of a well-ordered collection, might find something familiar in this. The comfort of knowing that things are in their correct places, in the correct order, filed carefully in the dark so that the surface can remain clear and functional and undisturbed. The ancient city and the modern archive share more than they might seem to. Both are places where the careful organisation of the past is understood as a form of protection for the present. And then there is the library. Ashurbanipal, who ruled Assyria in the 7th century CE, is known for many things: his military campaigns, his building projects, his carefully constructed image as a scholar king in a tradition that usually produced warrior kings. But what has lasted most durably from his reign, and what concerns us most directly here, is the collection. The great library at Nineveh, the one that bore his name, and that was, in his apparent understanding, nothing less than a systematic attempt to gather the total preserved knowledge of the ancient world into a single place, was organised according to a principle that sounds simple and is anything but. Every important text that could be found was to be copied and brought to Nineveh. Scribes were dispatched to temples and private collections across the empire. The tablets describe the king's instructions as specific and urgent. Bring the old texts, the ones that have not yet been copied, the ones held in temple libraries and private hands. Bring them here, where they can be preserved. The result, over the course of his reign, and the reigns that preceded it, was a collection estimated to have held tens of thousands of tablets covering literature, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, ritual, myth, and history. Among them were copies of texts that stretched back into the deep Sumerian past, including, almost certainly, versions of the king list and the stage tradition that carried Adapa and his companions forward from Eridu to this northern palace, 1,000 miles and 2,000 years removed from where the story began. Meanwhile, the library was organised, catalogued, shelved in specific rooms according to subject, tagged with ownership marks, clay tags attached to the edges of tablet bundles, identifying their contents and their place in the collection. Ashurbanipal's colophons, the ownership marks pressed into the edge of individual tablets, explicitly claimed not just ownership but purpose. These tablets were gathered for the reading, for the teaching, for the keeping, not for display. For use, the image of the king as collector is, in the Mesopotamian tradition, inseparable from the image of the king as descendant of the sages. Ashurbanipal's own inscriptions describe him, in careful Akkadian, as literate and learned in ways that his predecessors were not. As someone who could read the old signs, understand the antediluvian traditions, access the knowledge that the sages had originally brought from the Abzu, he was not simply claiming military power. He was claiming intellectual continuity with the deepest layers of the civilization he ruled. The library was the physical expression of that claim. To hold all the knowledge was to stand at the end of the long chain that began with Uana at the edge of the marsh in Eridu 6,000 years before, and the Apkallu stood at the doorways of the rooms that held those tablets. Stone figures, life-sized, calm, facing the threshold, the same gesture held through the centuries, the same unhurried attention directed at the boundary between inside and outside, at the passage between the ordered world of the archive and whatever lay beyond it. What the ordinary citizens of Nineveh made of the figures in the palace walls, how they thought about the fish-garbed presences they passed on feast days when the palace was opened, or how they understood the small clay figures placed in the walls of their own homes, the records do not say directly. What the records do say is that the practice was widespread, consistent, repeated across generations and across different levels of Assyrian society. The large and the small versions of the same protective gesture, performed simultaneously in marble and in clay, in palaces and in houses, by kings and by craftsmen who bought their household figurines at the market. The protective desire is not a royal luxury. It is an ordinary human one. The wish to have something standing watch while you sleep, something patient, something old, something that has been doing this long enough. The stone figures in the palace corridors. The spout across the lamplight stared across the lamplight at the doorways they guarded. Outside, the city moved through its evening. The river ran. The stars shifted slowly overhead. And the line of the ancient sages, carved into the wall, reached back through Ashurbanipal's library, back through the scribal rooms of Nippur, back through the paired columns of the Uruk tablet, all the way to the first morning in the marsh, before the first brick was laid, where, a little further down the wall, the carved record of that lineage eventually reached its end, and a different kind of history quietly began. A little further down the wall, that is where we are standing now. Past the great stone figures at the thresholds, past the paired columns of kings and teachers, past the long, stable stretch of antediluvian time with its impossible numbers, and its swept temple floors and its unhurried mornings. A little further down, the record changes. The Uruk list, like the king list before it, does not end the age of the sages with a dramatic announcement. There is no line in the clay that says, "Here the great teachers departed." No formal declaration of transition. The change happens the way most real changes happen, gradually and then completely. And then the new arrangement simply continues as if it had always been that way. What the tablets show, in the relevant section, is a shift in language. The word Apkallu disappears. In its place, the tablets introduce a different word, Manu, which translates carefully and approximately as Gosler. Craftsman, master of a particular knowledge, the human expert who inherits the role that the divine teacher once held. The Umanu are real people, or at least more recognisably so than the fish-garbed figures of the deep past. They have the kind of names that appear in other historical records. They are associated with specific kings from specific periods that archaeology can roughly date and verify. They are advisors and scholars and court officials, respected, learned, powerful in the particular way that knowledge is powerful but unmistakably human, mortal, bound by the same limits as everyone else. The transition is marked in the text with a quiet precision that is, in its own way, quite moving. The blank space on a clay tablet is not nothing. A scribe who left space was making a choice. They knew what went above the space and what went below it, and they chose to separate those two things with a gap, a breath, a pause, a visible silence pressed into the material. Some scholars who have studied the relevant tablets describe a perceptible shift in the scribal hand at this point in the list, as if the person copying the text understood that they were moving across a threshold and held their stylus slightly differently in response. Others note that the line spacing changes, or size of the signs shifts slightly, as though the scribe unconsciously adjusted their grip when the content changed. These are small observations. They may not mean what they appear to mean, but they are the kind of detail that accumulates into something when you sit with the material long enough. What is undeniable is that the Uruk list and related texts treat the shift from Apkallu to Umanu as a real and significant boundary, not a gradual evolution, a line. Before this line, beings from the deep water, carriers of primordial knowledge, the teachers who stood at the foundations of organised civilization. After this line, men, learned, capable, essential, but men. And the question of why the scribes drew that line so clearly and chose to maintain it so carefully across centuries of retransmission is one that the tablets do not answer directly. The truth is, the texts reflect a worldview in which the age of direct contact with the makers of knowledge had genuinely ended. The scribes who maintained this tradition were not simply recording a distinction between mythological and historical time, though they were doing that too. They were also expressing something about their own relationship to the knowledge they carried. They were the Umanu. They were the inheritors. They had received the blueprints and they understood the blueprints. And they could pass the blueprints forward. But they had not been present when the blueprints were first drawn. That original presence, that direct access to the source, was something they could describe and memorialise, but never reproduce. There is a particular feeling that goes with this kind of inheritance. Most people who have lived long enough will recognise it in some form. The moment when you realise that the people who first understood something, who built the original structure, who established the original form, are no longer available to ask. What you have is what they left behind. The written instructions, the material record, the copies of copies, passed down through hands that were trying their best, but were always, in some small way, further from the source than the hands before them. The Sumerian scribes lived with that feeling as a cosmological fact. The age of the sages was finished. The Umanu were what remained. And the Umanu's job was not replace what had been lost, but to preserve it as faithfully as possible, and to acknowledge, in the structure of their own lists, that they were working from inherited knowledge rather than original instruction. That acknowledgement is the blank space, the visible pause between the two halves of the lineage. For a while, the Umanu carried the tradition with evident care. The post-flood scholars appear in the historical record in ways their predecessors cannot. They have biographies of a sort. They are credited with specific contributions, a particular astronomical observation, a specific legal formulation, the composition of a text that can be assigned to their era. The great epics of Mesopotamian literature, including versions of the Gilgamesh cycle and various cosmological hymns, are associated in the tradition with specific Umanu who shaped or transmitted them. The human scholar replaces the divine teacher but inherits the function. The name of the role changed, the purpose did not. What is easy to overlook, in the long view, is what it cost to hold that function over the centuries. The Umanu were not simply recopying documents. They were maintaining the coherence of a tradition across political upheaval, dynastic collapse, invasion, the displacement of cities, the death of languages. The Sumerian language itself ceased to be spoken as a mother tongue sometime in the early 2nd millennium BCE, surviving only as a written language of scholarship and ritual, the way Latin survived in medieval Europe, understood by the learned and opaque to everyone else. And yet the texts in Sumerian continued to be copied, translated, commented upon, and taught in scribal schools for well over 1,000 years after the language had ceased to live in anyone's mouth. That is not a small thing. That is an extraordinary act of sustained collective will, performed by generations of people who believed, on some level, that the knowledge they were maintaining was more important than the convenience of letting it go. And yet, Eventually, the going became unavoidable. The late Babylonian period saw the last flourishing of the old scribal tradition. Uruk produced remarkable scholarship in the final centuries BCE. Astronomical records of startling precision, ritual texts of great complexity, the last cuneiform copies of traditions that stretched back to Eridu. And then, gradually and then completely, the tradition thinned. The Unkmunu disappeared from the record in the way that the Apkallu had disappeared. Not with an announcement, but with a trailing off. Fewer tablets, fewer schools, the knowledge becoming more concentrated in fewer hands, the hands becoming fewer with each generation, until at some point in the early centuries of the Common Era, the last person who could read Old Babylonian cuneiform was alive without knowing they were the last person who could read Old Babylonian cuneiform. After that, the clay simply held what it held, silently in the ground. The blank space that the scribes had once placed between the age of the sages and the age of the scholars expanded over time into something much larger. A silence of nearly 2,000 years during which the tablets lay in the dark and the story they carried had no voice. And then the shovels found them. The transition from the Apkallu to the Ummanu, recorded so carefully in those paired lists, is worth sitting with one final time before we move forward. The scribes who marked that transition were not mourning it exactly, they were naming it. They were acknowledging, in the most precise language available to them, that the world had changed, that the direct presence of the ancient teachers had given way to the human effort to continue their work, and that this change was real and significant and deserved to be visible in the record. The blank space is not grief, it is honesty. And then, a few lines further down the tablet, the Great Flood arrives, the event that the tradition places at the hinge of all history. The ending of the First World, the beginning of the Second, the moment after which everything was recognisably more like the world we inhabit now. The waters had been there from the beginning, under the city, under the marsh, in the deep Abzu that the Sumerians believed ran beneath everything they had ever built. Now the waters rose. The waters had been there from the beginning. That is the part that the Sumerian texts make very clear. The flood was not a foreign force arriving from somewhere outside the story. The water was the same water that had always been there. The water beneath the city, the water of the Abzu, the water that fed the rivers and the marshes and the springs, and the first shrine at the bottom of the archaeological sequence at Eridu. The flood was not an intrusion, it was a return. The deep water rising back up to reclaim what had been built on its surface. The Eridu Genesis, which is among the oldest surviving flood narratives in the ancient world, records the event in language that is quiet and final. The tablets describe the decision that the flood would come. And then, without drama, the waters arrive. Then the flood swept over. 5 words in the oldest known version. A line so short it almost disappears into the surrounding text. As if the scribes understood that some things do not require elaboration. The Mesopotamian plain is not difficult to flood. It is, by its nature, almost perfectly flat, with a water table that in some seasons comes close to the surface across enormous areas. The rivers that run through it, the Tigris and the Euphrates, carry enormous volumes of water from the mountains to the north and east, and they can and do flood catastrophically when the snowmelt is heavy or the rains come at the wrong time in the wrong quantity. Early cities built on the southern plain were exposed to this reality in every generation. The river that gave life could also take it. Archaeological evidence from several Mesopotamian sites, including shows layers of water-deposited sediment. Clean, fine-grained silt of the kind that floodwater leaves when it recedes, lying between earlier and later occupation layers. These are real floods. Historical events, compressed into the stratigraphy of the ground. Floods large enough and destructive enough to have left a mark that is still visible 4,000 years later under the careful brushes of excavating archaeologists. Let's see. Whether any single flood was enough to justify the cosmic scope of the tradition that grew around it is a question the geology cannot fully answer. What the geology can say is that the memory of catastrophic inundation in this landscape is real, and that the people who eventually wrote it down were drawing on something genuine. The way the Sumerian tradition treats the flood is worth attending to carefully, because it is not the way a story about disaster usually sounds. There is no panic in the Eridu Genesis. The water comes, and the world changes, and then the water recedes. The tone is the same administrative calm that characterises the rest of the king list. The same level, unhurried register that recorded the impossible reigns of the antediluvian kings. The flood is not presented as a punishment, or as a chaos, or as an ending in the sense of something being destroyed. It is presented as a boundary, a line, the thing that separates what came before from what came after. The water rises, the water falls, and then the world is quiet. Imagine the plain after the waters recede. The mud is everywhere, a thick grey-brown layer of fine silt deposited by the water over every surface it covered, over the flat ground, over the ruins of what had been built there, over everything the previous era had left behind. The mud is still soft and wet in places, cracking slowly as it dries in the sun. It smells of river bottom, of deep water and dark organic material, and the particular mineral coldness of sediment that has been lifted and moved and set down again. The reeds are flattened where the water moved over them. They will come back. Reed beds are remarkably resilient. Cut them down, flood them, walk on them, and they push back up from the root within a season. But right now, in the immediate aftermath, they lie in the same direction the water moved, like hair combed by a slow and heavy hand. The sky is clear. This is always the detail that matters in the aftermath of a flood. The sky clearing, the light returning, the particular freshness of air that has been washed. The birds come back first, small ones, moving quietly over the still water in the low places where it has not yet drained completely. Then larger ones. Then the sound of the plain returning to itself, slowly, bird by bird, and insect by insect. And somewhere in all that mud, if the tradition has any basis at all, in memory of real events, the ruins of the first cities lay covered. The shrines and the granaries and the scribal rooms and thresholds where the sages had once stood, all of it under a few centimetres of grey-brown silt, waiting for the next generation to come and clear it away or simply build on top of it, as people in this landscape had always done and would continue to do for thousands of years. Over time, the mud dried, the plain waited. The king list records the aftermath simply. After the flood swept over, kingship descended again from the sky, and the list begins again. This time with shorter reigns, with cities that can be found on maps, with names that sometimes appear in other records from other traditions. The world on the other side of the flood is recognisably continuous with the world before it. The same rivers, the same plain, the same need for the same things: water management, food storage, organised labour, the maintenance of sacred spaces. The blueprints the sages left behind were still there, preserved in the clay that the flood itself had, in its own strange way, helped to fire and harden. Because that is one of the things that flooding does to clay tablets, when conditions are right. It destroys organic materials. It dissolves unfired clay. But tablets that were already dried or fired, tablets buried in the ground or stored in structures that were inundated and then burned in the subsequent collapse, sometimes come out of that process harder than they went in. The heat of burning mud brick buildings acting on already dried clay tablets can produce something close to the fired ceramic that survives millennia. The flood, in a precise and slightly ironic way, preserved the record of what it destroyed. The silence that followed the water's retreat was not an absence, it was a preparation. The mud was the medium on which the next chapter would be written. New foundations pressed into the same ancient ground, new bricks shaped from the same river clay, new scribes learning the same signs in rooms that stood, perhaps without knowing it, directly above the ruins of rooms that had come before. What the Deluge represents in the Sumerian understanding is not catastrophe in the modern sense. It is a reset. A full stop followed by a capital letter. The world before and the world after were not different worlds. They were the same world at different stages of the same story, with the flood as the break between chapters. And the key thing, the thing the tradition insists on, is that the reset was not total. Something was saved. The knowledge was carried through. The me, the sacred formulas that govern civilization, the blueprints of brick making and canal digging and star reading and the proper maintenance of sacred spaces. According to the tradition, these things were not lost in the flood, they were preserved. By figures, the scribes believed acted under the guidance of the watchers of the old world, preserved in ways the tablets describe differently in different versions, but always with the same insistence. The core knowledge survived. The sages had given it before the flood, and after the flood it was still there, waiting in the mud for the hands that would use it. The water receded. The sky cleared, and on the washed surface of the ancient plain, under a sun that looked the same as it had always looked, the long, slow work of rebuilding began. Not from nothing, from memory, from the careful, patient inheritance that had been pressed into clay and passed from hand to hand for longer than the mind can comfortably hold, all the way back to the first morning in the marsh, before the first brick was laid. The next generation found the ground ready. They found the tools still viable, the knowledge still legible in the tradition that had survived the water, and they began quietly to build what the old world had only just finished teaching them how to build. They began quietly to build, and for a long time the building continued. But all building eventually stops. Not with drama, not usually with a single decisive event, more often with the slow, patient reclamation of the land itself. The sand moving in, the roof beams rotting, the plaster softening in the rain, the walls subsiding by a fraction each season, until one day they simply are not walls anymore. They are mounds, gentle rises in the landscape. Ground that was once a city and is now a hill, and will in time be indistinguishable from the plain around it. That is where most of the ancient world ended up. Eridu went first, in a sense. The city that the tradition called the beginning of all things was also, though, among the earliest to fall silent. The great temple sequences, those 18 layers of shrines, stacked one on top of the other, stretching from the earliest human settlement all the way up to the Neo-Babylonian period, represent a span of roughly 4,000 years of continuous occupation. And then the occupation ended. The city was abandoned, gradually and then completely, and the desert came in. The desert in southern Iraq is patient in a way that is genuinely difficult to describe. Sand moves continuously in that landscape, carried by wind across the flat plain, accumulating against any surface that interrupts its path. A fallen wall, a collapsed mud brick building, a temple platform no longer maintained. These become anchors for sand, collecting it, holding it, building up over years and decades and centuries until the original structure is entirely encased. The sand is not hostile. It does not destroy. It coves, and in covering, it preserves, in its own indifferent way. The mound of Tel Abu Sharain, the modern name for ancient Eridu, rose gradually above the plain as the city beneath it slowly became its own tomb. The buildings compacted under the weight of what accumulated above them. The wood and reed and organic materials decomposed. The mud brick softened and lost its shape and became, over time, simply more earth. But the hardest things, the fired clay, the stone thresholds, the heavy objects that sank to the bottom of the accumulated layers, these waited. They are still waiting, in most cases. The excavations at Eridu reached deep, but not all the way. The site has not been fully explored. Large portions of the city that was considered by the Sumerians to be the first city in the world still lie unexcavated beneath the desert surface. Whatever is down there, whatever tablets, whatever objects, whatever traces of the earliest people who stood on that particular patch of southern Iraqi ground and decided it was sacred, has simply not yet been found. It may never be found. Excavation is expensive, slow, and in many parts of the ancient Near East has been interrupted or made impossible by the political and military history of the past century. Some of the ground that holds the oldest stories in human civilization is not currently accessible to the archaeologists who would study it. That is not a tragedy, exactly. It is just how things are. The library's burned. That is the other part of the loss, and it has its own particular quality. When Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, taken by a coalition of Babylonian and Median forces, the great Assyrian capital overrun after a siege. The palace complexes were looted and burned. The rooms that housed Ashurbanipal's library, with their tens of thousands of tablets organised and catalogued and shelved, were engulfed. The roof fell in. The walls collapsed, and the tablets, in the rubble, and the ash and the compressed debris of a burned palace were preserved. The fire that destroyed the building hardened the clay. The collapse that buried everything sealed it from air and moisture and the further disturbances of time. When British excavators reached those rooms in the mid-19th century, they found the tablets not gone but present, broken. Yes, many of them in fragments, the neat organisational system long since scattered by the violence of the collapse. But there, readable. The cuneiform script still legible after 2,500 years in the dark. This is the paradox at the heart of the ancient record. The destruction preserved it. The fire that ended the library created the conditions under which the library survived. But not all of it. Some tablets burned entirely, leaving nothing but ash that held the faint impression of the signs for a moment and then dissolved. Some were crushed beyond legibility by falling stone. Some were scattered, and the pieces that belonged together were found in different locations, in different seasons of excavation, by different people who did not always know what they had or how it fit with what others had found elsewhere. The king list exists in multiple fragmentary copies, precisely because no single copy survived complete. The scholars who assembled the most complete picture of the antediluvian kings and their sages did so by piecing together fragments from different sites, different periods, different scribal hands. Each partial, each slightly different, each contributing something the others lacked. The picture is real, but it is assembled. It is the reconstruction of something that may never have existed in quite this form in a single place. And the names that did not survive. The Uruk tablet breaks off. The king list has variant readings. There are sages in some sources who do not appear in others, names that appear once and then nowhere else, kings whose sage companions are simply not recorded in any surviving text. Some of these gaps can be partially filled by inference or comparison. Most cannot. Whatever was written in those missing portions is not recoverable. The people who knew those names, who understood their significance, who could have explained the variants and the omissions, they are gone as completely as the tablets themselves. The oral tradition that supplemented the written record, the explanations that any trained scholar of the late Babylonian period could have given from memory alone, dissolved when the tradition dissolved. What remains is the outline, and the outline, in quiet moments, is enough to sense the shape of what is missing, the way the edge of a broken tablet tells you there was more, even without being able to read it. Meanwhile, the sand continues its patient work across the sites that have not yet been excavated. The tells rise and fall slightly with the seasons. The desert wind moves across them without urgency. There is a kind of peace in accepting this, not resignation, but something more settled than that. The recognition that most of human experience has not survived, that the vast majority of what people thought and built and sang and argued about and carefully recorded has simply returned to the ground, without leaving a trace that any future hand could read. This is not a failure of civilization, it is the nature of things. Clay dissolves, wood burns, memory fades. The particular conditions that allowed the cuneiform tablets to survive, the specific combination of materials and burial conditions, and eventually the specific moment in history when trained scholars arrived with the right tools and the right knowledge. Those conditions are not normal, they are exceptional. The survival of any ancient record is the exception, the loss is the rule. And sitting with that, quietly, in the way that the Sumerians themselves seem to sit with the ending of the antediluvian era, with acknowledgement rather than grief, with honesty rather than pretending, there is something that loosens in the mind, something that had been holding against the weight of all that silence. History is mostly made of silence, and the silence is not empty. It is full of things that happened and mattered and were real, and that simply did not have the luck or the fire or the right kind of clay to carry them forward. Eridu is a low mound in the desert now. The sand covers it gently, the first city, the place the tradition called the beginning of all things. At rest under the same sky it was founded, in the same southern plain, beside what was once the edge of the ancient waters. And somewhere nearby, barely visible above the surface, a fragment of mud brick sits where it has sat for a very long time. Part of something once. Part of a wall, perhaps, or a threshold. The clay that made it came from a river that still runs in a different channel now, across the same flat ground. The making and the unmaking, both, were always the same material. What happened to the lost names, the broken edges, the ash where tablets once were? These are the places where the story breathes out and does not breathe back in. And breathing out, as anyone who has ever been very tired knows, is not so different from rest. What survived the water and the fire and the sand and the long silence? That is where we are going next. What survived the water and the fire and the sand and the long silence was the most ordinary thing. Not a monument, not a throne, not a great stone figure carved by a powerful king to announce his permanence to the ages. What survived was a system, a method, a set of marks that meant specific things, pressed into a surface that could be carried in one hand, copied by any trained person, reproduced indefinitely, passed from place to place, and era to era, and language to language without losing its essential structure. Writing survived, and with it the knowledge that writing carries, or received, the Sumerians developed, or arrived at, through the accumulated pressure of administrative necessity, depending on which framing sits more comfortably with you, did not die with Sumer. It spread. Slowly, over centuries, the cuneiform script was adopted by neighbouring cultures, who adapted it to their own languages. The Akkadians used it, the Babylonians used it, the Assyrians used it. The Hittites, far to the north in what is now Turkey, developed their own cuneiform tradition. The Elamites, to the east in modern Iran, used it to write a language entirely unrelated to anything in the Sumerian family. Cuneiform became, across a span of roughly 3,000 years, the dominant writing technology of the ancient Near East. Not because any single empire imposed it, but because it worked, and because the people who learned it found it worth teaching to the next generation. The script itself changed over that time. The signs became more abstract, losing the pictographic clarity they may have had in their earliest form. The direction of writing shifted, regional variations developed. But the underlying system, the use of wedge-shaped marks in clay, organised into combinations that represented sounds or words, remained recognisable throughout. And when it finally faded in the early centuries of the Common Era, It did not disappear because something better replaced it. Exactly. It faded because the cultures that carried it were absorbed into larger political and linguistic systems that used different scripts, different languages, different materials. The clay tablet gave way to papyrus and parchment. The wedge mark gave way to the alphabet, which had itself developed in the broader cultural sphere that Mesopotamian civilization had influenced. The specific form died. The impulse behind it, the impulse to record, to preserve, to pass forward, did not. And the tablets themselves, the physical objects. The Weld-Blundell Prism is in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, in a room where the air barely moves. It has been there for over a century now, resting behind glass, the same fired clay it has always been. The same four faces of careful cuneiform, the same impossible numbers pressed with the same steady hand that pressed them somewhere around 1800 BCE. The tablets from Ashurbanipal's library are in the British Museum in London, where they have been since the 19th century excavations brought them out of the ground. Tens of thousands of fragments, catalogued and stored, and studied by generations of scholars who have spent their careers learning to read what the ancient hands wrote. The study of these tablets is not finished. New translations are still being published. New connections between different fragments are still being noticed by researchers who have spent decades with the material. The tablets are still speaking. The conversation with them is ongoing. The Uruk tablet, W.200307, the list that pairs the antediluvian kings with their sages in two quiet columns, is in a museum archive, preserved and catalogued, available to the scholars who study it. The missing portions remain missing. The intact portions remain clear. The text that survived still says what it always said. Each king had his sage, and the two together made something more complete than either alone. These objects moved from the ancient world to the modern one through an improbable series of accidents and choices. They survived floods, ice and fire, and the collapse of cities and 2,000 years in the ground, and the aggressive early archaeology of the 19th century, and the subsequent decades of careful scholarly work. They are here now, in temperature-controlled rooms, under careful lighting, in cities that did not exist when the clay that holds them was first pressed into shape. The Prism in Oxford is 4,000 years old. The Ashmolean Museum is 400 years old. The city of Oxford is roughly 1,000 years old. All of these numbers are dwarfed by the stories the Prism carries. Meanwhile, the knowledge of how to read the signs was lost for 2,000 years, and then slowly, painstakingly recovered in the 19th century by scholars who worked like the scribes of Nippur, carefully, patiently passing what they understood to the next generation of students who refined it further. The chain of transmission broke, and then a new chain was started, and now the texts can be read again. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. For a while, this is simply what humans do. They write things down. They copy what was written. They teach the copying to the next generation. They lose things and find things, and lose them again. They build structures to hold the most important records, and the structures fall, and sometimes under the right conditions, what's inside the structures survives the falling. And then someone, centuries or millennia later, finds the fragment in the ground, brushes it clean, holds it up to the light, and reads. There is a woodworker in Nashville who has probably drifted to sleep by now, not thinking about Sumerian kings, but carrying in some quiet part of his mind, the rhythm of this long story. There is someone in Cornwall whose evening routine, the same chair, the same window, the same dark outside, is a version of the same ritual the ancient temple scribes performed every morning, the repetition that holds the shape of a day together. There is an archivist in Vancouver who understands in the most practical possible way that the organisation of old records is not a bureaucratic task, but a form of care, the same care that placed cuneiform tablets in specific rooms according to subject and tagged them with clay labels so that future hands could find what they needed. They are all part of the same long, quiet continuum. As is everyone listening to these words tonight, in whatever country, in whatever room, in whatever particular quality of dark. The distance between tonight and the first morning in the marsh at Eridu is enormous. It contains within it more human lives than the mind can hold, more losses than can be counted, more moments of careful and patient work than will ever be recorded. And yet the continuity is real. The same impulse that moved a human hand to press a reed into wet clay 5,000 years ago is moving the hand that holds the phone, or the tablet, or lies open on the bed right now. The impulse to make a mark, to be present, to leave something behind, or to receive something that was left. The keeper of all stories does not live in any particular place. It lives in the aggregate of all the careful hands, all the swept thresholds, all lists copied out in cool, dim rooms, all the names pressed into clay against the inevitable advance of forgetting. It lives in the fraction of human experience that made it through, and in the willingness, tonight, to receive it. The Prism sits in its case in Oxford. The reeds grow back from the flooded marsh in the same season as always. The stars above the Mesopotamian plain are the same stars that the first astronomers of Eridu watched from their flat, open plain, tracking the patterns, reading the slow clock of the sky. Nothing about those stars has changed in the time we have been sitting here. The precession of the equinoxes continues its immense, patient revolution. The same wobble that may or may not be encoded in the number 432,000, still turning at the same rate it has always turned, indifferent to the empires that rose and fell in the tiny sliver of time at the surface of this planet. The ancient ones who first watched those stars did not know what we know about them, and we do not know what they knew about watching. Both things are true at the same time, and both are worth holding lightly before sleep. The story ends where it began, in the clay, in the flat dark of the plain, in the slow, unhurried passage of something very large through a very long time. You don't need to hold any of this. The day has already passed. The numbers and the names and the prisms and the flooded cities can rest now in their own quiet places, and you can rest in yours. You are at the far end of a very long human night that began in a marsh before the first brick was laid, and everything that was passed forward through those thousands of years, every careful hand, every swept threshold, every name pressed into clay, has been, in its own small and patient way, part of how you came to be here, in this room, in this moment, breathing this air. That is enough. It is more than enough. This is Velvet Night Vellum. The ancient words have found you. Sleep well, and may the stars guard your rest.